Today marks what would have been the late great Richard Holmes' 75th birthday. From casual enthusiasts to professional historians alike, he lit the spark that ignited the flame of learning for so many of us in the field of military history. To celebrate this landmark date, I'll be looking back at his work and career that is still so revered and beloved to millions, including myself, who has Richard to thank for a lifelong interest in all things military history. My own personal love for Richard's work started around the age of 10. It must have been a rainy day, or I just happened to stumble across a repeated episode of War Walks. Little did I know the effect it would have on my young mind. It wasn't the first military documentary I'd ever watched, but this was different. I was hooked. I only remember hanging on this man's every word. Whether it was seeing Richard walk up and down the fields of Agincourt in a full set of armour, or riding his trusty steed Thatch around battlefields in France, his presenting style was never dull.
How useful a sharpener is to men in that desperate situation. No less useful to me.
With the sheer amount of knowledge that was imparted during that half hour, you felt as if you were on a personal staff ride with him. When I was young, it always felt like he was speaking to me directly. It's a gift that I'm not sure anyone before or since has had. Richard could have put on a talk about paint drying, and you betcha I would have been lining up for a front row seat and buying the accompanying book. One moment in particular that stands out for me, seeing Richard scramble up the side of Douaumont Fort at Verdun in 1999's The Western Front series. He takes you down the fort with him, no need for flashy reconstructions, just to land where the action took place over 100 years ago, using the accounts of the men that were there to do the talking for him.
But he got to his feet to see that the only way into the fort seemed to be a firing slit high over his head. He ordered his men to form a human pyramid, scrambled up, and managed to wriggle his way in. The first German soldier had breached Verdun's strongest defense.
Fans, friends, and former students of Richard have kindly recorded some of their memories for this video. Starting with my friend over at the Armourer's Bench, Matthew Moss. He picks out some of his favourite memories of War Walks and Richard's unique presenting style.
It was his pieces to camera, direct and packed with information. They gave you insight into the context of the situation and gave you an insight into how the men fighting the battle actually felt. He might have had a rifle, a Maxim gun, or even a Matilda tank. It was these visual aids that captured my imagination. When I first watched War Walks, all those years ago as a young lad, it fired my imagination and ignited a passion for military history which still burns strong. So, for his excellent TV shows, brilliant books, and his passion for history, I admire Richard Holmes.
Last year, I was lucky enough to interview historian Peter Caddick-Adams for the channel. He was a student and close friend of Richard's for many years.
Richard was kind enough to sort of take me under his wing and say, right, what you need to do is come and work for me at the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham, and we'll find a post for you as a lecturer there. And that was it. So I was Richard Holmes's sort of sponsor. He was my sponsor, and he really was almost my uncle. Certainly my friend, colleague, and mentor from then until his death. I miss him daily, and I always think of him just sort of peering over my shoulder, telling me what to read or whatever. And of course, our great thing was that we both loved doing battlefield tours and staff rides.
Hi, I'm Paul Woodadge of World War II TV, and these are my Richard Holmes memories. I first met Richard 20 years ago. It was at Hillman, the fortification inland from Sword Beach in Normandy. I was with a tour group, he was with a tour group, and he'd overheard a couple of things I'd said to my group, and while his group were taking photos, he came over and asked me about them, and he listened very intently and said, I didn't know that, and I thought, what a humble man to listen to a guy who didn't know who I was and incorporate some of the things I said into his own presentation. The second time was, I think, a year or so later. I was walking down the main street in Bayeux, again in Normandy where I live, and he was sitting outside a cafe. Peter Caddick-Adams was there, as I recall, and I guess some of his tour group. And he saw me, and I saw him, and he said, "I know you, don't I?" Something like that. And I said, "Yes, we met last year or a couple of years ago." He said, "Pull up a chair, let's talk Normandy." And he pulled up a chair for me. I sat down and we talked about Normandy and guiding and history and D-Day, whatever it was we talked about. And I thought at the time how gracious it was of him to invite me, a younger, essentially stranger, to sit and join him and his discussion with his friends. And I believe he even invited me to dinner. They had a reservation somewhere. I couldn't go. Had other plans, and we parted, and I don't believe I ever bumped into him again, but I always appreciate his graciousness in allowing me, a nobody, to go and sit at his table and just talk about history. And I try now to incorporate a certain Richard Holmes-ness in the way I interact with people who are younger than me. As I've become older, one of the senior tour guides in Normandy, I try and think about how Richard was to me all those years ago and act with grace and a welcoming nature to younger historians. So that's my abiding memory of Richard Holmes. I believe his work with War Walks and other TV shows and his books will live long beyond he himself did, tragically taken from us at such a young age, and he is just one of the guys that we will all look up to, I guess, forever. That's it. That's my memories of Richard Holmes. What an amazing man. Thank you very much.
Richard Holmes was my PhD supervisor. I met him on the 20th of August 1997 at his home. I was introduced to his wife Lizzie, and there were quite a few dogs present, and we sloped off to his study and discussed several options and concluded that a form of German counterinsurgency known as Bandenbekämpfung would become the topic of my thesis. One of the fondest memories I have of that period was after I was offered a position at the University of Aachen. Richard wrote a reference and it was handwritten, and the German authorities and the administration had never seen an official handwritten letter by a professor forwarding a reference for a PhD student. And I was called up to the the dean, and discussed for 20 minutes over a cup of tea who this English gentleman was. So Richard's legacy continues. In my case, over the last period of research together, will culminate in my next book, Birds of Prey, which is about the Luftwaffe security operations in Poland. The book is dedicated to Richard, and apart from his advices, which are woven into the narrative, there is significant references to my two favourite books by Richard, which remain my constant work companions, and those are Dusty Warriors and Riding the Retreat. It's difficult to encapsulate what Richard passed on to me over those 14 years, except to state that he changed my life completely, and so much for the better. And I would thank Richard, if I could, for all the gifts, all the generosity over that period of time.
Hello, my name's Gary Sheffield, and I've been asked to share my memories of Richard Holmes. I first met Richard when, at the age of 24, I joined the War Studies Department at Sandhurst as a very junior lecturer. Well, Richard was the deputy head of the department at the time, and he was incredibly kind. He took me under his wing, gave me all sorts of really good advice, and I really owe him a great debt of gratitude for that. Well, he then left Sandhurst and went off to another job, but I hooked up with him again many years later when I worked with him on the Higher Command and Staff course, which is the sort of training course for future very high commanders. And in particular, I worked with him on a number of extensive staff rides across Western Europe. And Richard, again, was absolutely in his element. He was a natural raconteur. He had such a vast knowledge of military history. And it was a real pleasure being with him, seeing him in action and working alongside him. I admired his books immensely. My favourite one is actually his book Redcoat, which he looks at the experience of the ordinary soldier in the 18th and 19th century, ordinary British soldier that is. And he gave me all sorts of ideas about how I might pursue my own work. And one of the most generous things he did actually was, because he knew I wanted to write a book on the experience of the British soldier in the Second World War, he decided he wouldn't. He would do something else. And in fact, that's the project I'm working on now, is an expansion of that, which actually has taken a very long time to produce. But I owe Richard a debt of gratitude for that as well. He was a great man, a huge loss, and 10 years after his death, I still miss him.
As well as Richard's TV work, his books are still a staple of many bookshelves, writing over 20 books during his career that span from the days of chivalry and swords to the modern British Army in Afghanistan. Richard's insight and penmanship is still as popular as ever, and they are still in print to this day. The books that I cherish the most are my signed copies of Tommy and In the Footsteps of Churchill. I was lucky enough to go to a talk on this book in 2005. I met him after, and I'm not afraid to say I was awestruck. He shook my hand and remarked that I might have been the youngest person he'd ever seen at one of his lectures. It's one of my most fondest memories, and I remember him wearing some very, very snazzy suspenders, and he made a comment about wearing the good stuff when he was out on his tours.
In Cairo, the Egyptian capital, the British feared the worst.
He was always dressed for the occasion, whether it was short sleeves for the deserts of North Africa, tweed jacket and walking boots for the muddy fields of Belgium, or this one-off shades and convertible combo for a joyride around Boston in 2003's Rebels in Redcoats. His style can only be summed up by me as country casual, but Richard just had a way of pulling it off every time. So here's to you, Richard. We wish you a happy birthday, and we raise a glass to your enduring memory, to the students and the lovers of military history. You will never be forgotten. Thank you. Thanks for watching. To everyone who contributed on this video, it means a lot. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next one.